Welcome to Macon Memories. I'm Lynda Wright at Randolph-Macon College. Today is May the 11th, 2022, and I'm here today with Professor Ted Sheckels, the Charles J. Potts Professor of Social Science and Professor of Communication Studies. Welcome, Ted. Ted, you've been teaching at Randolph-Macon for more than 40 years, and we have lots of topics to cover. So why don't we start at the beginning, and you can tell us how and when you happened to come to Randolph-Macon College.
Okay, fall 1980 is when I arrived at the college. I already at that point had a job at a small liberal arts college outside Philadelphia, but my wife and I wanted to get married, and so she applied for jobs in Philadelphia, and I applied for jobs in Virginia. And guess who got the new job? I got the job in Virginia. It was a strange job, too, because the job description was somebody who could teach 17th and 18th century literature, literary criticism, had a good background in teaching freshman composition, and could revive pretty much from scratch an intercollegiate debate program. And so everybody who saw the ad kept sending it to me saying, who do you know there or who there knows you? Because it was a perfect description. And so I got the job and I, got here in August 1980.
Well, that is quite a variety of teaching load, and that's one thing we'll really get to is what a variety of teaching and scholarship you've continued through those 40 years. So when you got to the department, you were in the English department. Do you want to talk about the development of the English department or the development of communications through the years?
Well, communication studies didn't happen officially until 2010, so it's kind of a later topic. The English department was, with one partial exception, pretty much all men. Very Southern. They were suspicious of me. They thought I was a Northerner because my PhD was from Penn State. Then they realized I was from Maryland and I was kind of okay because Maryland's kind of Southern. Gradually over the years, the English department changed. People retired and new people were hired, and I think slowly the department moved into the 20th century. In some ways it was kind of stuck in time when I got here. It wasn't like the department that I had left, which was much more diverse and up-to-date and lively. But gradually we caught up.
And what kind of courses did you bring into those changes?
Into the changes? Well, it was hired to teach 17th and 18th century. And when I was in graduate school, I took a seminar in what was then called Commonwealth Literature. It was the only course in the area, and that was Canadian, Caribbean, African, Australian, Indian, New Zealand, and I was interested in the topic. I didn't do a dissertation in that area because it was a dead end. There were no jobs in that area, so I did a very traditional dissertation. But that area always intrigued me, and so, I don't know when it was exactly, I suggested to the chair that maybe I do a course in that area, which led to several courses in that area, which actually led to, really my major research in literature. I've never published a thing in 18th century literature, but in, Canadian and African and Australian a fair amount. Mm-hmm. So somehow that took over.
Mm-hmm. So you really found a field that was ripe for harvest, and you developed that. And so talk more about that, Margaret Atwood, or do you want to talk more about that field of study for you?
I think what intrigued me about that particular area was that it was very political. In fact, it was the political dimension that drew me into late 17th, early 18th century literature. My dissertation was on, political satire. The Commonwealth literature was very political, dealing with, the plight of third world people, revolution, political changes that were going on, even in places like Australia and Canada. And so, that's what drew me into that particular area. As far as particular topics in the area, I just kind of went where, I was most intrigued. I was interested in what was going on in South Africa. It was still during apartheid, and so the political upheaval there and the literature surrounding it interested me. I'm not exactly sure why I got interested in Australian film, except I saw a number of very interesting Australian films, and that caused that to take off and led to my reading some more of the Australian literature. Atwood, Canadian literature always intrigued me, but I read in an anthology of short novels a single piece by Margaret Atwood, and I read it in one sitting. I was fascinated with it. And back then we had, along with some other liberal arts colleges, a grant from the Mellon Foundation to do a summer faculty development program. And it was at the University of Richmond. They weren't involved in it. They were just where we did it. And while I was there, looking around in the University of Richmond library, I pulled off the shelf several other books by Margaret Atwood and thus began, exploring her work more. But it was the one little novella I read, Surfacing, in that anthology, which caused me to really get intrigued by her.
I love that serendipity and the way you just followed your interest. Well, while we're talking about different courses that you taught, you have just taught in such a wide variety of English and communications.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk a little bit about some travel courses that you've done through the years?
I really haven't done very many travel courses. You mean courses with students?
Yes.
No, just one, and just recently, and it was really Alfie and Jefferson's idea that a bunch of us go to Kenya.
Yeah, I knew that you had gone to Kenya.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that you had probably done a lot of travel
No,
courses.
I thought of doing one to Australia. I thought of it several times, and I just thought that the expense was going to be too great. Yeah. And I know that Serge takes kids over there all the time for wine tasting. But I looked at the airfare and said, this just isn't going to work.
Right.
Plus, going there in January, oddly enough, is the most expensive time to go there because it's summer in the southern hemisphere. Right. When we had a May term, and we had a May term for a very short period of time, it might have been feasible because it would be winter there, or whatever, late fall there. But no, Kenya was the only. I've traveled a lot with the debate team, traveled with students, various places. But the only travel with students was to Kenya.
Well, since you mentioned debate, you mentioned that in your very first remarks that
Yeah.
was part of the job description, and
Right.
and you've been in charge of debate in Randolph-Macon since you've been here. So talk
Yeah.
about that. That's a lot.
I was an intercollegiate debater. I was a high school debater and then a scholarship college debater. And I always wanted to, do something in that area. I remember when I was up in Philadelphia, I proposed it to the president, and he said, "How much money would that take?" And I told him, and he said, "Don't think we can afford that right now." But when I got here, when this job, became available, well, all of a sudden, it was something I could do. And so, during those 42 years, what we have done has changed from one kind of debating to another kind of debating. Along the way, we were able to add forensics events because we changed leagues, and we were now in a league that had debate and forensics side by side, not two separate things conflicting with each other. So there have been changes over 42 years, but that's been a very good experience.
Well, can you talk about the Franklin Debating Society and a little bit of the history of that and why that is so important to the college?
Well, of course, it goes back to the beginning. down in Boynton, there were the two literary societies. And many people don't know this, but participation in the one or the other was a requirement for graduation. You had to be in the one society or the other. And back then they were both debating societies. They did other things. And they debated each other, and sometimes they would debate other schools, usually just 2 or 3 schools, nothing like today. And of course, the two societies played a role in building Wright Hall here on campus. So it's been a part of the campus here from the very beginning. The Washington Literary Society became a literary society, sponsoring literary readings and editing a literary magazine. But the Franklin Society stayed a debating society. And it's had an off and on history. There have been periods of inactivity, but it has had, compared to a lot of others, a pretty steady history. So much so when I got here to revive it, one of my colleagues in the English department was the former coach. And so there wasn't much of a gap, and he was able to, give me all sorts of, memorabilia from the days when he coached. And, there have been members of the Board of Trustees who were members of the debate team. Alan Rashkin, for example. So, it wasn't, there was a gap. I don't know how many years there was a gap, maybe 5 years, 4 years. But it's been pretty steady over all the years since Boynton.
Who was the faculty member who had been in charge of debate before you came?
Edgar McDonald.
Just like to state, just for the history, right?
Yeah, Edgar was in charge, and then for 1 year, Richie Watson did it, but Richie wasn't really interested in it. It wasn't his thing, and that's when it died. And when a vacancy came up in the department, the president and the dean, were insistent that debate be revived. I don't think the English department particularly cared. But the president was Liddell Payne. Liddell had never debated, but he had gotten sucked into coaching debate for a short period of time when he was a faculty member in California. And Elton Hendricks, who was the dean, later went on to be president at Methodist University down in North Carolina. Elton had debated. And so the president and the dean wanted it, and therefore, therefore it happened.
Right. Well, and that was lucky for us, and on lots of levels. But you ended up coming to the college, and we kept that tradition going. I'll just say, for the record, as a librarian, many of our older books, the books that we have in the library that were from the Boynton era, in fact, probably all of them, if they were in the library during the Boynton era, they either belonged to the Franklin Literary Society or the Washington Literary Society. They had their own libraries, which became the core of the college library.
The college had no library when the college came here. The only library was the upstairs of Wright Hall.
Right, but the books in it were from those two literary societies, and so it's lovely to see in the 19th century hand, and a lot of times it's just abbreviated FLS, or WLS, not as much. More, I think I see more. Well, I don't know. That may not be true, but more or less. But I just want to state that history is just very important to all of us. While we're on the subject of debate, did you want to talk about the Ethics Bowl and that history and how that evolved? Or
I'm really not much connected with it. I have served as a judge at it several times, but I've never been involved in coaching the team. I've just been an observer of it, a judge at it. A lot of my debaters have been, involved. There's a backstory there. The Ethics Bowl was originally, I won't name names, coached by faculty in economics and business, because we had a faculty member who was interested in ethics, and when the VFIC said ethics, the president said, well, it would make sense for this person to be in charge. And what he did was he recruited econ majors to be our performers. Anyway, one year we hosted, and when you host, because there were only 15 VFIC schools, you have to provide a 16th team, which can't win. And somebody suggested to this professor that maybe just grab 3 or 4 debaters and have them be the 16th team. When they accumulated a record that ought to have had them winning the entire event, they realized that, hey, maybe the debaters ought to be involved more. And so since that moment when, the 16th team made up of random debaters, should have won, since that moment, debaters have been heavily involved in the team.
Very interesting. It's sort of like the Russian athletes not being able to compete under their own flag, but having to just...
Yeah, the 16th team.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, one of the econ professors involved, he wasn't the primary one, was Ed Showalter. And Ed is the one who suggested that maybe the debaters ought to be involved. Because Ed was a Randolph-Macon debater.
And when you were coach,
Yeah.
presumably, yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Ed and I were freshmen together, so to speak.
Right.
He was a freshman and I was a first-year faculty member.
Very good. Well, so were you involved in the development of the Collegiate Forensic Association?
I have been president of it for I don't know how many years, more than 10. To some extent because nobody else wants to be president of it, which is, kind of the way it always goes. No, I didn't. It was developed by 2 other faculty members, and when we got involved, initially we were just participants, but quickly I ended up, being more than just a participant. But when we got involved, we insisted in order to get involved that they add, this needs a little bit of history, okay? A little bit of history. We had done policy debate, which once upon a time was the only kind of debate that existed. Increasingly, we became less and less satisfied with it. The speed of delivery went way, way up. The amount of research necessary to win went way, way up. The schools we competed against had, 3 faculty coaches and 4 grad assistants, and it just became very, very difficult, particularly at the varsity level, to do well. Every now and then, but not very often. So we were looking for something else to do. In the early 80s, a lot of debate programs, particularly in New England, lost their coaches. The faculty members weren't tenured, they'd been coaching debate, they hadn't been publishing, so Harvard, Princeton, Yale, et cetera, all lost coaches, and it looked like they would lose debate programs. But the students still wanted to debate. But they didn't want this heavy research style of debating. So they looked across the border to Canada and saw that the Canadian universities were doing a parliamentary style, which is extemporaneous. It's a different topic each debate. And they said, hey, that looks like fun. And they formed a student-run league, the American Parliamentary Debate Association, which quickly became Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Smith, Mount Holyoke, Swarthmore, a really elite group of schools. So we tried that out. We went to our first tournament. I actually went with them. Coaches are rare in this league. But I went with them because this was kind of an exploratory mission to a tournament at Smith. 100 and some teams. Our team that had never done parliamentary debate before ended up finishing 3rd. Why? Because they were very good policy debaters. They were not new debaters. They had just never done this kind of debating before. And one was probably the most talented orator I have ever coached.
That was?
Scott Ford.
Uh-huh.
Doug Ford, if you know.
Yes.
Doug, former trustee, former debater too.
Yeah.
Doug's son. Scott was lazy. He didn't do the research, but boy, could he speak. He and his father both were excellent speakers. So Eloquent Scott and his partner, who's now off, her name is Annette Warfield Hughes, who's now off in Melbourne, Australia as a senior solicitor with a big firm. Her major client is the Australian Football League. Yeah. Scott and Annette, wowed them. And, we liked parliamentary debate. We did both policy and parliamentary for a while. But eventually, policy debate was just not working. There were some problems with APTA. The fact that it was student-run meant that there was a real quality difference from tournament to tournament. They used student judges, and they didn't randomly place the student judges. So if you were doing well, you got a qualified judge. If you were not doing well, you got somebody they dragged off the street and trained for 15 minutes. So since we always had a mix of, good people and people we were trying to develop, it just wasn't a good match. And so a lot of people were getting out of policy debate. There were a couple of other smaller schools that had, bolted before we did, and they had joined CFA, and they said, well, why don't you come over and do what we're doing? And I said, well, I like the idea of adding the forensics piece because we've had lots of students down through the years who have asked, do you do forensics? And they've had to say no. They also did Lincoln Douglas debate, but I wasn't, thrilled with it. And so I said, well, we'll join you, but only if you add parliamentary debate. And they said, sure. And so, we brought parliamentary debate into CFA, and, we've been involved in CFA ever since. That was probably about 1998, 98, 99, 97, 98, 99.
Well, that's very interesting, and thank you for the background. Can you talk a little bit about the debaters that you've brought from other countries here that have visited the college?
Yeah, well, the National Communication Association, one of its subsidiaries is CIDD, the Committee for Intercollegiate Discussion and Debate. And over the years, CIDD has sponsored tours from international debaters coming into the country, as well as sent U.S. debaters abroad. And there used to be a lot more tours than there are right now. But the one that has endured the longest is British. The British coming over every year. It didn't happen during COVID, but the British coming over every year. And we have hosted them probably 13, 14 years in a row. We also go back and forth. We send a team to Japan, and a coach goes with them. And I was actually the coach that went with two students to Japan in 2015. Ruth Bierman went with a team in 2019 because she got on the committee after I got off the committee. So, we have gone on the tour to Japan. But a couple of times we've hosted the Japanese debaters here. So it's always fun to do. The issue is always, are you going to draw enough of an audience? And, the audience has varied from year to year. We had for a very short period a requirement that students had to go to a certain number of events per year, and the debates were always listed. And there was one year, we typically have a dinner before the debate. The dean was Rob Holyer, and Rob and I are walking over to Wash Frank Hall, and we noticed that there was a huge crowd outside the door. And we both had the same thought, that Physical Plant had forgotten to unlock the building. No. It was an overflow crowd because there was this requirement. And students needed to go to an activity. It was late in the semester, and here was this activity. We had more people than we could possibly fit in Wash Frank. So we actually, commandeered, Rob and I, a group of people who removed the furniture from Wash Hall and put it outside with a podium. Meanwhile, some fraternity guys had gone across the street to frat houses, and couches appeared. And I thought, this is not going to work. But it did. And so we had the debate on the steps of Wash-Frank Hall. And the four debaters, two of our guys and the two Brits, were loud enough, we had no microphones, loud enough to project to the audience. We had to deal with a couple of trains, but we were accustomed to that because of graduation being over there at that time. So that was the largest crowd we ever got. But sometimes the crowds got kind of small.
Well, that's great. Well, that really does harken back to the Lincoln Douglas debates. If you had it outside and the trains going by, so you had the feel of a real 19th century debate. That's great.
Yeah, the resolution was that the United States should require people to vote, and it was Monday before Election Day, and so it was a pertinent topic. We argued no, the British argued yes, you lazy Americans.
Oh, that's good. I went to a couple of those British debates that you've had here, and it's just a lot of fun because the audience gets in and
Right.
cheers, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, they put on a good show usually, and the British Debating Council chooses people who are usually quite good, quite polished. So, yeah, that's always a good show.
Well, speaking of Wash-Frank Hall, sorry.
I was going to say the Japanese debater, there's more of a language issue. So they're not quite as good a show. So you have to think about that more in terms of cultural exchange. Because they are debating in a second language. The Brits are not.
Yeah, right. I was just going to go back to Wash-Frank Hall, I understand you know quite a bit of the history of Wash-Frank Hall. You mentioned it very early on. So if you would like to tell us about that and anything you know about the restoration, or just as a topic you thought you might be able to expound on.
I hope I'm telling the truth. This is a story that was told to me by Bill Gibson. Bill, I don't know if you know who. Yeah, Bill was the chaplain, and he was director of college relations. And as I've said to several people who have asked me very recently, when I got here in 1980, he was the only college administrator whose office was not in Peel Hall. Every college administrator was in one building.
One floor of one building.
Well, no, I mean...
early on, they were, yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, but Bill was in a little wing of Old Chapel by himself. Bill tells me that Wash-Frank Hall was about ready to be demolished. There were fences around it. You could not get near the building. It was in very bad shape. And Bill told me that one day, Mrs. Paul Mellon came by on a train. And she pointed out to her social secretary this building that her grandfather had built. And being a good social secretary, he or she, I don't know the gender of the person, did some research and found that the building was about ready to be torn down. And $9.5 million later, it was restored to, as far as we could, the condition it was when Jordan Wheat Lambert was one of the officers who was involved in building the building. So the downstairs is, pretty much the way it was back in the 19th century. Some of the stuff is original, some of the stuff is, copied from photographs. Some of the artwork is the kind of artwork we imagine would have been on the walls, and a few pieces are actually pieces that were up in the attic that probably were on the walls. And upstairs was transformed into, a classroom, a conference room, and a suite of offices. That's not the way it was in the 19th century. But it's a beautiful building when it was first opened after being restored, and it just wowed people.
And was Liddell Payne president during that time?
Yes.
Yeah, right. I think I recall that. That's wonderful, and what a gem to have those three old buildings on the old campus facing the tracks that really make not quite a quadrangle because we have the railroad tracks,
right.
but making a
triangle.
quad. Yeah, right. Okay.
And all three of them have been turned into, interesting buildings and useful buildings.
And retain a nice character of what we call the old campus, I think.
Yeah.
Well, early on we mentioned the development of the communication studies major,
Yes.
and you mentioned that that was a recent development. So talk about that as a development of a major and a department.
In 1990, about 1990, Jerry Garris, another, former provost, Jerry Garris and I had a conversation about developing a communication program. And that was 1990. It took 20 years to convince the faculty that it was a good idea, because the faculty, who thinks that there's a list of liberal arts areas and other areas don't belong, said to me over and over again that communication wasn't a liberal art. And I kept saying, well, it's heavily rhetoric, and if you go back to the history of the liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, one of the three core areas is rhetoric, but that didn't, it was like talking to a wall. We decided around 2010 that we needed to add programs, and I was actually on a committee that looked at possible new programs, and it was a committee whose advice didn't go anywhere because eventually the dean or provost, I'm not sure what Bill Johnson's title was, one or the other. Yeah, dean provost, we've gone back and forth. But I think he declared that, small institutions didn't have provosts, so he was a dean. Anyway, he didn't realize that, of course, everybody on the committee was pitching their own idea. And so when he realized that all he was getting was people pitching their own idea, that committee kind of fizzled. But he convened another committee that wasn't a bunch of faculty, and that, committee alums, heavily alums, they recommended programs that should be added, and the top one on their list was communication. Now, that may have something to do with one of my former debaters being on the committee, but we'll leave that aside. She did us a lot of good. She was, what was Catherine? She was a triple major in econ, biology, and environmental studies, and a minor in ethics and journalism. She was editor of the newspaper, and she was also a star debater speaker.
And what was her last name?
She was Catherine. She was Catherine Noyes. She's now Catherine Noyes Carter. Since leaving here, she has 2, maybe 3 master's degrees.
Oh my goodness.
She has a master's in environmental management from Duke, a master's in business administration from UNC Charlotte. And the last time I asked her, she was working on a master's in public administration from UNC Charlotte. She works for an environmental management consulting firm in Charlotte. Anyway, Catherine was on the committee, and she recommended communication, and everybody said yes. And so when we started considering new programs, Asian Studies beat me by a month, but it was one of the first programs that the faculty considered and approved it. 2 departments were opposed. I won't name them, but except for those 2 departments, like a 77-9 with 9 abstaining vote, it passed. People figured out that it was sufficiently liberal arts, and rather quickly, the Resources and Plans Committee looks at new programs, and they had told the faculty that it might attract 4 or 5 new majors. In 1 year, we had 30, and in 3 years, we had 120, which is what I was telling the faculty. Yeah. So it became very successful very fast.
And one of the most popular majors at the moment, and growing.
Well, it was growing. It has gone down a little bit. When business came in as a major, business took a lot of people away from lots of other majors, because students hear business and they think jobs. And our parents hear it and they think jobs. But we're doing well. We're doing well. But our peak was maybe a couple of years ago, but the numbers are good.
Yeah, very good. Well, I want to change a little topics a little bit and just note for the record that you were director of the college's summer session for more than 20 years, and I'd like for you to tell us about your work in that area or any other sort of extra departmental work service to the college.
Summer session here is a weird thing. The college never wanted to embrace it. They wanted it to be off to the side because back in 1980, the college basically closed down in the summer. And even most administrators were 9-month employees. And so, I think I've got this right. Stuart Monroe was asked to develop a summer program. He worked on it, I think, for one summer, do everything. And then Greg Doherty took it over, and then I took it over. But we did everything. We recruited the faculty, we did up the catalog, we hired a resident assistant, we were responsible if there were any dorm issues. Student services wanted nothing to do with it, housing wanted nothing to do with it, the dean's office really wanted nothing to do with it. The only person who was really interested was the treasurer, because we made a profit and he wanted to know how large the profit was. Because quite frequently, Bill Ball, when he was treasurer, would chase me around. He would find me walking on campus and stop me in his car and say, "Do you know what the number is yet?" Because he needed the number to balance the books at the end of June. So it was very much a faculty-directed entity. One of my goals as I was doing it was to get the administration to play a larger role in it. And I don't know whether this is the argument that was telling, but I told, I'm not sure what dean it was, it's probably Rob Hollier, that, hey, if there's a problem in the dorm and, something goes wrong and you've got a professor of English who's handling it, but yet you've got this housing staff that's just sitting there, we could have a legal liability problem. And all of a sudden, housing took over the housing part of the job. I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but I think that the college recognized that if we have housing, if we have expertise that knows how to handle res life issues, that expertise ought to be doing it, not an English professor. And so and all along the way I said, really this ought to be, not something a faculty member does as a side gig, but this ought to be part of the college's program. When I stopped doing it, Jack Trammell did it for a couple of years, and then it got finally taken in to the provost's office. And so now it's no longer this, faculty-run entity, but it's a strange story. We developed it because we knew that we had, some of our own students who needed summer courses. We really were not pitching it to the general public. And those were students who typically had fallen behind, students who had failed organic chemistry. They were a large market. So it was very much done to serve our own students. And I think it still has that orientation. We're not trying to, get a lot of, students off the streets.
Right, and to give students a chance to get some courses that they may not be able to, weren't offered if they couldn't get in.
When I stopped doing it, there were two groups of students. There were students who were behind, who needed something, specific, usually for a particular requirement, like the lab science requirement. They couldn't get in any lab science during the regular academic year, or they didn't like the ones that were offered. The other were students who were trying to accelerate their program and graduate in 3 years. So we had kind of a curious dual market, students who were struggling and students who were excelling, trying to design a program that appeals to both groups.
And some of those in the same courses, so that makes
Yeah. It was a challenge for the faculty. But again, I did all of it, and gradually I got rid of some of the tasks, turn them over to people who really had a lot more background than I did.
Mm-hmm. Any other extra departmental service to the college you'd like to talk about?
We, the Higgins Academic Center, when it came into existence, from the very beginning had a writing center and a speaking center, and I was the director of the speaking center. Mm-hmm. And it eventually, as we talked about earlier, out in the hall, got merged in with the writing center. But that occurred because the speaking center really lost its major market. In the first year seminar we had, the year-long program, there was speaking that was required. And a lot of our customers were from those courses. And it also gave, those of us in comm the opportunity to, sell the center not only to all of the students who were in those courses, but to their faculty. Mm-hmm. But once we abolished that first year program, our number of consultations went from, several hundred down to 2 digits, mm-hmm. like in a year, mm-hmm. because, that was our major market. So it made sense to blend writing and speaking. A separate speaking center, mm-hmm. Really didn't make sense anymore. Mm-hmm. We're still struggling there. We can't get, we have a requirement that students take a speaking attentive gen ed course. We can't get faculty to make their courses speaking attentive. We have a communication across the curriculum, a communication and context requirement, which involves writing and speaking. We can't get enough faculty to do that because of the speaking component. Mm-hmm. So there has not been a great deal of support for speaking things at this institution. Mm-hmm. Which is why it's kind of amazing we got a communication studies major in.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I know writing across the curriculum was a big thing in the 90s and
yeah, I was heavily involved in that at my previous institution. My previous institution was one of the 2 places in the nation where writing across the curriculum was created. Mm-hmm. And I was assistant director of writing to a big name in writing across the curriculum, mm-hmm. Elaine Mayman. And I came here thinking we should do writing across the curriculum, speaking across the curriculum. I have been an advocate for it since 1980, and no, it's an idea that just hasn't really worked well here.
And you've mentioned your former institution just as a former institution.
Yes.
Can you tell me the name so we have for the record?
Well, when I was there, it was Beaver College. It's now Arcadia University.
Right. Okay.
It changed names and identity after I left. Mm-hmm. After I left, my dean, who was wonderful, was appointed president. Mm-hmm. And she made, amazing changes at the institution. Mm-hmm. I still keep up with several of my faculty colleagues there. Mm-hmm. When I go to Philadelphia, I have dinner with a couple of them. Mm-hmm. And, it was struggling when I was there. Faculty here don't want to hear this, but when I changed jobs, my salary went up $4,000. Mm-hmm. And, back then.
Then in 1980.
Yeah. So, I mean, the college I was at was not, faring all that well. Right.
But doing it all right now.
Oh, yeah.
Good.
They were visionary. They added all sorts of programs. They added physical therapy long before we ever thought of it. They built buildings and added programs, and they're added graduate programs, and they're thriving.
Good. That's good. I'm always glad to hear
Yeah.
that. Somebody's doing well. Yeah, good. Well, I want to loop back to something you said earlier. One of your first responses you talked about, or how you were interested in Commonwealth literature, mm-hmm. was because it was political. In recent years, you have focused on political communication, and I just would like to loop back and state for the record that you are one of the most prolific faculty members we have in terms of publications and scholarly research. And I just want to give you a chance to talk about some recent things you've worked on. You've published with other faculty and students, mm-hmm. and let you.
Well, a lot of it is in the political communication area. I have a book on Margaret Atwood, and I'm working on a second book on Margaret Atwood. I have books on Australian film and a book many years ago on South African literature and another book on Canadian women writers. But really recently, most of the work has been political. When, you know, before we became communication studies in 2010, I was teaching a course in political communication. And I forget exactly when that course came into existence, but I had two comm courses in existence before we became a minor, even, because we were a minor before a major. I taught the political comm course, and I remember going to political science, because it had to be a political science course to get students.
Yeah.
Had to be cross-listed. And two members of the political science department were very opposed. This guy in English, he can't teach political science courses. The other two guys, one of whom was the provost, Jerry Garris, and the other, Howard Davis, said, looks like a great course. And so the two who were opposed said, okay, you two are the American government people. This course will count in your area, so okay. And so political comm came into existence thanks to Howard Davis and Jerry Garris. And I also developed at that point a gender issues course in communication, which was a fun course to teach. When we hired Joan Connors, she took that one over. We needed things that existed for Joan to teach because there wasn't a major yet. And so she picked up that. But those courses go back to probably mid-90s, if not early mid-90s. I've long been interested in politics. I worked on my first political campaign in 1964. Johnson Humphrey, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Montgomery County, Maryland. I worked for Gene McCarthy in 1968, anti-war candidate. I've worked for other political candidates. I've written for members of Congress, members of the Senate, freelancing, writing bits of speeches. So I've been heavily involved in politics. And what happened is, there's a national organization for communication. And debate coaches would go there and, they'd present and talk. And so I went, not initially, but after a couple of years, to what was then the Speech Communication Association, now the National Communication Association. And I would, go to the sessions that dealt with debate, but I also went to the sessions that dealt with political comm. And I said to myself, I can do that. I'm a rhetorician. I can look at, and so that was sort of the beginning of my research in the political communication area. And so every election year, I typically have something out there in one book or another. Done a couple of textbooks in the political comm area. A political comm book that I did with Joan Connors and Lauren Bell. A political comm reader I did with some colleagues from elsewhere. A presidential rhetoric anthology, which I did by myself. And a couple of other books that touch on a speech writing textbook that I did partially with a former student. I wrote the book, she wrote the sample speeches.
Awesome.
Because when I taught the course using another book, the book had problems. It was the best book out there, but it had problems. But one of the problems was all of the examples were, polished speeches written by, famous people and delivered by, and the students couldn't connect to them. And so for the book that Caroline and I did, we said, we're going to have you, former student, a couple of years after graduation, write the sample speeches. So they're much more accessible, and it's worked very well. So I've done textbooks in the political comm area as well as research studies in the political comm area.
Fascinating, and it's great just to see how you're still excited about your research because you're doing things that interest you and just see where the interest takes you.
Yeah, after retirement, I can't imagine not doing something on maybe not 2022, but 2024, because there are a couple of books that come out every 4 years, with contributed chapters, and I'm probably already in line to do the convention chapter for 2024, since I did the convention chapter for 2020 and the convention chapter for 2016. And so, I'll certainly do something, for 2024.
Good.
And I'm working on a book on Margaret Atwood, so.
Another one on Margaret Atwood.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, and I do want to just also state one interest that sounds interesting to me is your interest in musicals and Broadway.
Oh. It's the one common interest my family members all have. We would go to New York, my wife and I and our two daughters, and see 2 or 3 shows. And we all like Broadway musicals. I have particularly liked the Broadway musicals that have a political edge. And so the course I taught here, honors course, was on the political side of Broadway. So we started with shows like Showboat and South Pacific and West Side Story and moved all the way through Hamilton. I actually have an essay coming out on Hamilton in the context of previous political musicals. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't hit there. A lot of the people who write for Broadway, write the book or write the music or write the lyrics, they're all kind of left-wing political types. And although they knew they were writing primarily for entertainment, they would put political messages in. And those are the shows that have always intrigued me. And they developed, certain techniques for insinuating the political message. You know South Pacific?
A little bit.
Okay.
Wash that man right out of my hair.
Okay. Well, you would think if you're just sitting there watching it, that it's, a romantic story. It's set during the war in the South Pacific. And around, scholars of Broadway call it the 10 o'clock song. There is typically a song that is done around 10 o'clock, and it is in many cases the zinger. And the song that was the 10 o'clock song in South Pacific is the song You Have to Be Carefully Taught, which is where 2 of the characters talk about the racism that is influencing what they are doing. There's the young soldier who's involved with the Polynesian girl, but no, he's from prim and proper Philadelphia. And, this is just a fling. And there's Nellie Forbush, who's involved with the older Frenchman, and she discovers, not so much that he had children, but he had children with a Polynesian girl, which puts her off that particular romance. And, they sort of do together the song, You Have to Be Carefully Taught. And all of a sudden, the audience realizes that this is not just a romantic story about World War II. This is a story with a deeper meaning. So that's one technique, sort of sliding the political message in without people noticing it. Or in the case of Cabaret, that the nightclub is the Kit Kat Club, KKK. When they did it on Broadway, they sometimes had to make that a little bit more obvious because, why would an audience in 1965 care about, Germany between the wars? Well, it's because the show wasn't just about Germany between the wars. So, the article I have coming out on Hamilton looks at how Hamilton uses some of those earlier rhetorical techniques and sort of adds to the list of what can be done.
Interesting. And you said that's a forthcoming article?
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
It's in a whole book on, the rhetoric of Hamilton.
Very interesting, because I know Lin-Manuel Miranda said that he just grew up on Broadway musicals, and so that's, even though Hamilton is a reinterpretation of that, is interesting. That's his background. So. Yeah.
Also, in The Heights, which I saw on Broadway before it won the Tony Award, one of our trips up to New York. I didn't think it was as political as it is until the movie came out and I read the book that he and some others had put together talking about, the Broadway version of In the Heights and then the movie and what they were trying to enhance as they went from Broadway show to movie. Mm-hmm. So that's a more, subtle political show than Hamilton.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very interesting, just very interesting. And I look forward to possibly reading your article when it comes out. Well, at the retirement reception there, where you were honored last week, you described the importance of the liberal arts as preparing mm-hmm. students to lead, mm-hmm. and you also talked about the changes you've seen at Randolph-Macon mm-hmm. through the years, but some of the constants. I wondered mm-hmm. if you wanted to expand on that or just give you a chance to sort of wrap up things as you think about your...
I think the one major constant is the close relationship the faculty have with the students. Mm-hmm. And, I am still in touch with less so former students, more so former debaters. Mm-hmm. Like we have to, when we go to a tournament, have a judge for every 8 slots we enter, and we enter close to 60 slots. So we have a core of alums who go, pretty far back, mm-hmm. who, still travel with us. Bobby Thomas is now, in the philosophy department here as an adjunct. He's one of them. And, Catherine Noyes-Carter is another one who's still working with us. So I'm still in touch with many of those students. But I think in general, that close student-faculty relationship is a commonality, is probably the thing that I see that has endured the most. Mm-hmm. The changes have been, maybe it's good that we've been reluctant to change, but personally I think that we've been sometimes slow to change. Communication ought not to have taken 20 years, to make the argument that it was sufficiently liberal arts. As I said, not quite so strongly the other day, some faculty here think that there is a list of liberal arts. It's the following 7, 8, 9, 10 things and nothing else. And, if you go back to classical antiquity, the liberal arts were the arts that were necessary for the people who were going to be the civic leaders to provide that leadership. And of course, those have changed. Mm-hmm. And we ought to embrace a little more readily the new areas without thinking that we're, selling out the liberal arts. Mm-hmm. What people think of as the traditional liberal arts, I of course hope will thrive. But there are other areas we can bring in, give them maybe a little bit of a liberal arts feel. I remember I was chair of the curriculum committee when the accounting major was proposed. And a lot of faculty thought, accounting, that's not liberal arts. And we actually got that one through rather easily. George Lowry was chair of the econ department. And he said, well, they want me to explain why this is liberal arts. I said, go to our catalog. We outline what we think the goals of a liberal arts education are, and just go down the list and argue that accounting meets all of these goals. And the faculty, when I think when they saw that, they kind of went, oh. So, accounting does teach problem solving. Accounting does. So, we've been slow to embrace some new areas. There are still some people who think we shouldn't be doing nursing, we shouldn't be doing engineering. But I think we need to be alert to what the needs are for those who are going to be, the leaders in whatever area it might be. Mm-hmm. I think we should be doing more in the health area. A couple of us have argued that we should have a public health major. But that's not going anywhere right now.
I noted that you had taught courses in health communication. Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a cross-disciplinary aspect of health.
That's a fun course to teach. I have no background in it. It's a big area in comm that you can get a PhD just in health comm. Wow. Huge research area. Somebody needed to teach it. I taught it. Then we turned it over to an adjunct who actually had a PhD in health comm. But she left because her husband was doing his residency here, and then he had to move on to someplace else, or he was doing his internship here and had to move on to someplace else. Then we had another faculty in comm who we unfortunately lost because she, wanted to get married, and her future husband couldn't leave Illinois for custody reasons, child custody reasons. And so we lost Sarah, but Sarah taught it, and now I'm teaching it again, right now. Tomorrow afternoon, last class. It's a fun class to teach because, we talk about the interpersonal side of health communication, doctor-patient, and, other interpersonal, dimensions, but also the mass comm side of it. So advertising and public health campaigns and the way medicine and health are portrayed in the media, like on TV. So it's a fun course to teach, but I think we could do a little bit more in that area, particularly with the pandemic just having hit us. Public health. This is, I think, the project of one of our board members who happens to be a professor of public health at Hopkins. There is a need for, more people in the public health arena. And it's very much tied in with civic leadership. So I'm hoping that might be an area.
Well, the pandemic certainly opened their eyes to public health in ways that we just never thought about consciously, I'm sure, before.
Hopkins has a BA, MA program. You have two options under it. One is very social science. The other is more scientific. And, we could pretty much take that model and tweak it a little bit and do it. It would be very liberal arts. Most of what was in it would be, courses we would already be, inclined to teach. So, but we need to say that, these areas that are out there that citizens need to know about, leaders need to know about, we need to embrace them. And I think we've been slow to embrace them. We've, been at times too traditional.
Well, Professor Sheckels, I want to just state for the record a couple of things. I just want to note that you were the A.G. Ingram Professor of English from 2008 to 2011, and as I mentioned earlier, you are currently the Charles J. Potts Professor of Social Science. I also want to note that you received the Samuel Nelson Gray Distinguished Professor Award in 2019, and just yesterday you were, promoted, elected, or whatever, Professor Emeritus for the college. So I just want to say congratulations on 42 years of wonderful work at the college and before and beyond. It looks like you got a lot of projects on the horizon. So I want to thank you for coming to Macon Memories, and just say, were there any more memories or any final story or word that you'd like to share?
Well, I do have fond memories of being in the English department, although, I really wish that I was able still to do a little bit more with literature in that department. But we are so very departmental here that once Joan Connors and I seceded and moved across the street, my involvement in the English department diminished very quickly. But I still do work on literature. And I have, fond memories of that department, the way it changed and grew. Dow Wooten was a very gifted leader because he was so laid back. You didn't always know he was leading. So he put up with a lot. He had to tolerate a lot. And he tolerated a lot without saying much about that which he was tolerating, and gradually steered the department, from one century to another. So I have fond memories of that. But I was glad that we were able to, build something new. it's been good.
Well, congratulations on your retirement and, 42 very productive and just successful years here. And thank you for coming to Making Memories.
Thank you.